On a bright autumn morning in 1928, the streets of New York reflected a world that believed it had finally mastered prosperity. Office workers hurried past glittering shop windows filled with radios, automobiles, and modern appliances, symbols of a new age of comfort and confidence. Newspapers spoke of rising stock prices, industrial growth, and endless opportunity. The scars of the First World War seemed to be fading, replaced by a collective belief that economic progress was not only real but permanent. Few could imagine that within a year, this confidence would collapse, dragging the world into the deepest economic crisis it had ever known. The years following the end of World War I were marked by a powerful desire to rebuild and move forward. The war had devastated Europe, destroyed industries, and claimed millions of lives. In contrast, the United States emerged stronger than ever. Its factories had expanded during the war, its financial institutions grew in influence, and its cities became centers of global trade and innovation. By the early 1920s, the U.S. had become the world's leading economic power, lending money to European nations and shaping international markets. This period, later called the Roaring Twenties, was defined by rapid industrial expansion and technological change. Mass production transformed industries, allowing goods to be manufactured on a scale never seen before. Automobiles rolled off assembly lines, radios entered millions of homes, and electric power reshaped urban life. Advertising encouraged people to buy more, promising happiness through consumption. A new culture of modernity emerged, celebrating speed, progress, and wealth. Banks and financial institutions played a central role in fueling this growth. Credit was easy to obtain, and borrowing became a normal part of life. Ordinary people took loans to buy cars, homes, and household goods. The stock market, once the domain of wealthy investors, opened its doors to the middle class. Investing in shares was no longer seen as risky but as a smart and modern way to build wealth. Confidence in the market was so strong that many believed prices could only rise. However, this prosperity rested on unstable foundations. While factories produced enormous quantities of goods, workers' wages did not rise at the same pace. Wealth accumulated in the hands of a small elite, leaving much of the population with limited purchasing power. As a result, production began to exceed demand. Warehouses filled with unsold goods, but instead of slowing production, companies continued to expand, driven by competition and optimism. The stock market became the clearest symbol of this imbalance. Share prices rose rapidly, often disconnected from the actual performance of companies. Speculation replaced careful investment. Millions of Americans bought stocks on margin, borrowing money from brokers with the expectation that rising prices would cover their debts. This practice magnified profits during good times but made the entire system extremely vulnerable to sudden change. While urban industries appeared prosperous, the agricultural sector told a different story. Farmers, especially in the United States, faced falling prices throughout the 1920s. During World War I, demand for food had increased, encouraging farmers to expand production and take loans for land and equipment. When the war ended, demand declined sharply, but production remained high. Crop prices collapsed, leaving farmers trapped in debt and poverty. This rural crisis was largely ignored by policymakers, even though it was an early warning of deeper economic trouble. Across the Atlantic, Europe's recovery was uneven and fragile. Many countries were burdened by war debts and the cost of reconstruction. Germany, in particular, struggled under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which imposed heavy reparations and territorial losses. To stabilize its economy, Germany depended heavily on loans from the United States. Programs such as the Dawes Plan temporarily eased the crisis, but they also created dangerous financial dependence. Europe's stability was tied closely to American prosperity, making the global system highly interconnected and fragile. International trade further complicated the situation. Rather than promoting cooperation, many nations adopted protectionist policies to shield domestic industries. High tariffs limited imports and exports, reducing global trade. These policies may have provided short-term relief for certain sectors, but they weakened the international economy as a whole. Economic nationalism replaced cooperation, increasing competition and mistrust among nations. Despite these warning signs, optimism dominated public discourse. Governments believed that market forces would regulate themselves. Economists and business leaders celebrated growth and innovation, dismissing concerns as unnecessary pessimism. Newspapers highlighted success stories, reinforcing the belief that prosperity was a permanent feature of modern life. The idea that a major economic collapse could occur seemed outdated, belonging to a less advanced past. Yet beneath this surface confidence, the global economy was increasingly unstable. Overproduction, unequal wealth distribution, excessive credit, and speculative investment created a system dependent on continuous growth. Any disruption in confidence could trigger widespread collapse. The interconnected nature of global finance meant that a crisis in one country would quickly spread to others. By the late 1920s, the gap between appearance and reality had grown dangerously wide. Stock prices soared, but consumer demand weakened. Farmers suffered, workers lived paycheck to paycheck, and international debts remained unresolved. The world economy stood balanced on a fragile structure of trust and expectation. As 1929 approached, few noticed how thin that structure had become. The confidence that sustained the system was strong, but it was also fragile. When it finally broke, the consequences would be catastrophic. The prosperity of the 1920s, once celebrated as a triumph of modern civilization, would soon be remembered as the calm before a global storm, one that would reshape economies, destroy faith in democracy, and push the world toward conflict on a scale even greater than before. The first signs of danger did not arrive with noise or drama. They appeared quietly, hidden behind falling sales figures, nervous investors, and small declines in industrial profits. In early 1929, a few economists warned that the stock market had grown dangerously inflated, but their voices were drowned out by optimism. Confidence had become the currency of the age, and as long as it remained intact, few were willing to believe that collapse was possible. When confidence finally broke, it did so with breathtaking speed. In September 1929, stock prices began to fluctuate in unusual ways. Investors who had borrowed heavily to buy shares grew anxious, fearing that even a small decline could ruin them. As rumors spread, selling increased. What began as caution soon turned into panic. On October 24, thousands of investors rushed to sell their stocks at once. The market struggled to absorb the volume, prices plunged, and the illusion of control vanished. Financial institutions attempted to intervene, but the fear had already spread beyond containment. Within days, the collapse deepened. On October 29, later remembered as Black Tuesday, the market experienced a complete breakdown. Millions of shares were dumped at any price buyers would accept. Fortunes that had taken decades to build disappeared in hours. The stock market, once seen as the engine of prosperity, became a symbol of betrayal and ruin. For many, the crash marked not just financial loss but the collapse of faith in the system itself. The damage extended far beyond investors. Banks, which had used depositors' money to finance speculation, found themselves unable to recover loans. As fear spread, people rushed to withdraw their savings, triggering bank runs across the country. Thousands of banks failed, taking with them the life savings of ordinary families. With credit frozen, businesses could no longer operate. Factories reduced production or shut down entirely, and unemployment rose with terrifying speed. Cities changed almost overnight. Once crowded industrial centers filled with jobless workers searching desperately for employment. Bread lines stretched along sidewalks, and soup kitchens became essential for survival. Families lost homes, moved into overcrowded apartments, or built makeshift shelters on the outskirts of cities. Hunger and homelessness became visible realities of daily life, challenging the belief that modern society could protect its citizens from disaster. The crisis did not remain confined to the United States. Because global finance was deeply interconnected, the shockwaves traveled quickly. American banks, desperate to recover losses, recalled loans from abroad. This decision proved catastrophic for European economies already struggling with debt and reconstruction. Without American capital, businesses collapsed, currencies weakened, and unemployment surged across the continent. Germany suffered particularly severe consequences. Its economy, heavily dependent on foreign loans, collapsed under the sudden withdrawal of credit. Industrial output fell sharply, and millions lost their jobs. The social fabric of the country began to tear apart as hunger, despair, and anger spread. Democratic institutions, already fragile, appeared incapable of responding to the crisis, eroding public trust in government. Britain and France also faced declining exports and rising unemployment, though their economies proved slightly more resilient. Still, industrial regions were hit hard, and working-class communities bore the brunt of the suffering. Across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, economies dependent on exporting raw materials experienced dramatic price drops. Farmers and laborers found themselves earning less while costs remained high, deepening poverty on a global scale. Instead of cooperation, governments responded by turning inward. Nations raised tariffs, restricted trade, and attempted to protect domestic industries at the expense of global stability. These measures reduced international commerce even further, intensifying the crisis. What had begun as a financial collapse evolved into a worldwide economic paralysis, as countries competed rather than collaborated. The social consequences were profound. Traditional family structures were strained as breadwinners lost their roles. Children left school to work, often in unsafe conditions. Psychological stress led to rising rates of illness, depression, and social unrest. Crime increased in some areas, while in others, communities struggled to survive through mutual aid and informal support networks. The belief that hard work guaranteed security no longer seemed true. Perhaps the most lasting impact of the Depression was the destruction of political confidence. Democratic governments appeared slow, divided, and ineffective. Parliamentary debates and legal processes seemed powerless against mass unemployment and hunger. Many citizens began to question whether democracy itself was capable of addressing such a crisis. In this atmosphere of frustration, radical ideas gained attention, offering certainty where uncertainty dominated. By the early 1930s, the world had entered a new and frightening reality. Economic collapse had become a daily experience rather than a temporary setback. International trust had broken down, and political stability weakened alongside economic security. The global order established after the First World War no longer functioned as intended. The crash of 1929 was no longer just an event, it was a turning point. It reshaped societies, altered political attitudes, and exposed the vulnerabilities of modern economies. What followed would not simply be recovery, but transformation, one that would lead nations to seek solutions in strength, control, and power. The consequences of this search would soon extend beyond economics, pushing the world toward a conflict far more destructive than anyone in 1929 could have imagined. By the time the economic crisis settled into everyday life, desperation had begun to replace shock. What initially felt like a temporary collapse slowly revealed itself as a long and grinding reality. Jobs did not return, savings did not recover, and governments appeared increasingly distant from the suffering of ordinary people. In this environment, the question was no longer when the economy would improve, but whether the political systems in place were capable of saving society at all. Across many democratic nations, faith in elected governments weakened steadily. Parliamentary debates, coalition politics, and slow legislative processes seemed powerless against hunger and mass unemployment. For millions, democracy came to represent delay, compromise, and failure. People who had once believed in gradual reform began searching for leaders who promised swift and decisive action, even if it meant sacrificing political freedoms. Germany stood at the center of this transformation. The economic collapse had struck with exceptional force, turning an already unstable society into one overwhelmed by fear and resentment. Streets filled with unemployed workers, while businesses closed and banks failed. Families that had once considered themselves secure fell into poverty within months. The democratic government relied increasingly on emergency powers, bypassing parliament and reinforcing the perception that democracy was broken. In this atmosphere, political extremism gained momentum. Traditional parties struggled to offer solutions that felt immediate or convincing. Meanwhile, movements that rejected democracy altogether spoke with clarity and confidence. They offered simple explanations for complex problems, assigning blame and promising national rebirth. For a population exhausted by uncertainty, these messages carried powerful emotional appeal. Adolf Hitler emerged as the most effective voice of this anger. He did not present himself as a politician, but as a savior who understood the suffering of ordinary people. His speeches transformed economic despair into national humiliation, arguing that Germany's misery was not accidental but imposed by enemies within and outside the nation. He promised work, dignity, and a return to greatness, framing obedience and unity as the price of recovery. Economic collapse played a crucial role in making such promises believable. Millions of unemployed citizens were no longer concerned with constitutional principles, they wanted food, stability, and purpose. The Nazi Party organized rallies, offered discipline, and projected strength at a time when the state appeared weak. As economic conditions worsened, support for extremist parties grew, and moderation lost ground. The turning point came when economic fear translated into political power. Elections became expressions of protest rather than policy choice. By the early 1930s, the Nazi Party had transformed itself from a marginal movement into a dominant force. Once in power, Hitler moved quickly to eliminate opposition, dismantle democratic institutions, and centralize authority. Economic recovery became inseparable from political control. Germany was not alone in this shift. In Italy, economic instability reinforced an already authoritarian system. The promise of order and national pride resonated with citizens who feared decline. The state expanded its control over industry and labor, presenting unity and discipline as economic virtues. Political dissent was suppressed in the name of stability. In Japan, the Depression weakened civilian government and strengthened the military. Economic dependence on foreign trade made the crisis especially painful. As exports collapsed, Military leaders argued that territorial expansion was necessary for survival. Control over resources, they claimed, would restore prosperity. Gradually, democratic institutions gave way to militarized governance, and expansion became official policy. These regimes shared a common logic. Economic suffering was portrayed not as a failure of leadership, but as evidence that the nation had been betrayed or constrained. Recovery required strength, obedience, and expansion. Individual rights were framed as obstacles to national survival. In this worldview, democracy was not a solution but a weakness. At the same time, democratic states struggled to respond. Britain and France faced their own economic difficulties and deep social divisions. Fear of instability made leaders cautious, and public opinion favored peace at almost any cost. Economic weakness limited military readiness, reinforcing reluctance to confront aggressive regimes abroad. This hesitation further emboldened authoritarian leaders, who interpreted restraint as permission. The international system proved incapable of containing these developments. Institutions created to preserve peace lacked authority and enforcement power. Economic cooperation, once seen as a path to stability, collapsed under nationalist policies. Each country focused on survival, even if that meant ignoring the growing threat posed by authoritarian expansion. Within societies, economic recovery became tied to militarization. Rearmament created jobs, revived industries, and reduced unemployment. Factories that once produced consumer goods shifted to weapons and infrastructure. For many governments, preparation for conflict appeared to offer what democracy could not: speed, unity, and economic revival. By the mid-1930s, the consequences of the Depression had fully reshaped global politics. Economic crisis had destroyed not only markets but trust in institutions, in cooperation, and in compromise. The appeal of authoritarian rule lay not only in ideology, but in its promise of certainty during chaos. What began as a financial collapse had evolved into a political revolution. Economic despair had rewritten the relationship between citizens and the state, replacing participation with obedience and debate with command. Nations moved steadily away from cooperation and toward confrontation, convinced that survival required strength rather than understanding. As dictators consolidated power and democracies hesitated, the world drifted toward an unavoidable conclusion. The economic crisis had not merely damaged economies, it had altered how nations understood power itself. Recovery, pride, and security became linked to force. The road ahead no longer led toward reform, but toward conflict, one that would soon engulf the world. By the late 1930s, the world no longer lived in uncertainty but in expectation. The question was not whether conflict would come, but where it would begin. Years of economic collapse had transformed political ambition into military planning, and national recovery had become inseparable from territorial expansion. The international order created after the First World War had eroded quietly, replaced by a fragile balance maintained through hesitation rather than strength. For authoritarian states, economic revival through militarization had proven effective. Factories once silent now produced weapons, vehicles, and infrastructure. Employment rose, discipline tightened, and national pride was carefully cultivated. Yet this recovery depended on constant motion. Armies required resources, industries demanded raw materials, and political legitimacy rested on visible success. Expansion was no longer a choice, it was a necessity. Germany moved with calculated determination. Economic planning centered on self-sufficiency and rearmament, but domestic resources were limited. To sustain growth, the regime looked outward. Each territorial move was presented not as aggression, but as correction of injustice, of weakness, of history itself. Borders were tested gradually, not through sudden war but through bold actions that challenged international resolve. The response from democratic powers revealed the lasting impact of economic trauma. Britain and France remained haunted by the memory of the previous war and constrained by financial weakness. Public opinion feared conflict more than compromise, and leaders believed stability could be preserved through negotiation. Economic recovery at home took priority over confrontation abroad, reinforcing a policy of restraint that authoritarian states interpreted as opportunity. Each unchallenged advance reshaped expectations. Agreements lost meaning, and international law appeared flexible. Smaller nations watched as guarantees dissolved under pressure, learning that survival depended less on treaties than on power. The absence of firm resistance encouraged further risk-taking, normalizing the idea that borders could be changed without consequence. Meanwhile, in Asia, expansion followed a similar logic. Economic vulnerability and limited access to resources pushed military leadership toward conquest. Control over territory was framed as economic protection, ensuring supply chains and national security. Civilian voices weakened as military success translated into political authority. War was not declared abruptly, it unfolded gradually through occupation and escalation. Global cooperation, already weakened by the Depression, collapsed entirely. Trade agreements lost relevance, alliances became cautious, and trust evaporated. Each nation calculated risk in isolation, assuming others would avoid confrontation. The very fear meant to prevent war instead removed the obstacles that might have stopped it. Within societies, preparation for conflict became normalized. Military service was presented as duty and honor. Education, media, and culture reinforced narratives of strength and destiny. Economic hardship had conditioned populations to accept control and sacrifice, making mobilization easier. War no longer appeared as disruption but as continuation of recovery, pride, and purpose. At the same time, diplomatic language grew increasingly hollow. Conferences produced statements without enforcement. Promises were made without intent to act. The gap between words and reality widened until credibility itself became a casualty. International institutions designed to preserve peace lacked authority, their failures reinforcing the belief that power alone determined outcomes. The final collapse came not as surprise but as release. When invasion crossed from threat to action, it merely confirmed what years of economic and political transformation had already made inevitable. Alliances activated not out of confidence but obligation. Declarations followed movement, not the other way around. War began not as a single decision, but as the cumulative result of choices shaped by crisis. What followed was total war, fueled by the same forces that had emerged from economic collapse. Industry, labor, and science were mobilized on an unprecedented scale. The Depression had taught governments how to control economies in emergency. War expanded that control further. Civilian life blurred into the military effort, as survival became collective rather than individual. Looking back, the path from economic collapse to global conflict reveals no single moment of failure, but a chain of adaptations. Nations adjusted to crisis by prioritizing strength over cooperation, certainty over compromise. Democratic hesitation and authoritarian decisiveness interacted in ways that rewarded aggression and punished restraint. The Great Depression did not cause war by itself. Rather, it changed how nations understood security, power, and responsibility. It stripped away confidence in gradual reform and replaced it with urgency. In that urgency, fear became policy and expansion became solution. World War II emerged not only from ideology or ambition, but from a decade of economic trauma that reshaped political behavior. Markets collapsed, institutions weakened, and trust disappeared. In the absence of stability, force appeared reliable. By the time guns fired, the foundations of peace had already been destroyed. The story of this period is not simply one of conflict, but of warning. It demonstrates how economic failure can undermine political order, how desperation can legitimize control, and how the pursuit of recovery without cooperation can lead nations toward catastrophe. The world that entered war in 1939 had already lost peace long before the first shot was fired.